Okay, so chapter 13, this is the video that is for cohort A's viewing. So what you're going to see, a couple of the slides that we looked at in our actual classroom that come from chapter 12, you can, I'll kind of skip over those. The reason I put them into this slideshow is this is the one I'm going to discuss in class with cohort B at the end of this week. So uh, that's why they're in there. Is trying to make two sets of slides with minor differences. I just confuse myself sometimes, so that's why they're in there. Heck, they're a good review. One of them especially. And I will mention, like I did in class, but I'll say it in the video in the hopes that everybody views it, is the team presentations. You guys got back to back. So as we discuss chapter 13 today, I'm going to talk kind of around both the Uncle Tom's Cabin and Dred Scott. Dred Scott kind of comes on the heels of what we're talking about here anyways, but so I don't steal the thunder, so we'll have to plug those in, but this kind of gives you an overarching kind of what the country's doing. We're moving away a little bit at least from the details of slavery and more to this idea of antebellum reform. Remember, antebellum was a word of the day a few classes ago that means before the war. And so there are some impulses to make things better, but most of the time, in fact, in the end, all the time, they're overcome by those two polarizing elements of abolition and fire eaters, the destruction of and defense of slavery as an institution. So that's where we are. As far as the team presentations go, remember, it takes all of you to build it. So if there's somebody out there not doing their part, teams can get different grades. Just because you're on a team doesn't mean everybody gets the same grade. So if you do nothing to help support the team, don't put any effort into it, that doesn't mean you're going to get the same grade as those who do put in the effort. And I've graded teams in the past a few A's and an F for somebody that didn't do anything. So don't be that person, right? Put in the time and effort that you need. Like, you guys have divided the topic up. It looks like everybody's doing the who, what, why, where, when, how. So just do your part. I mean, you're talking not what, an hour or two of work, and the idea behind it is to learn something about the subject. So don't be the weakest link, right? Okay, no real tech time other than that, so let's move on. Right, you guys saw this, maybe. I don't know if I got to this or not, but it's kind of this timeline of looking at the abolishment of either the slave trade or actual slavery itself. And you can see other countries leading the way ahead of America that, yes, we banned the slave trade as part of the Constitutional Compromise 20 years after it's signed, but it's not until victory in the Civil War and the 13th Amendment where we actually outlaw slavery. Because the Emancipation Proclamation, wonderful document, but it didn't do anything. So it was talking about slaves held in states in rebellion against the Union. The South didn't care what Lincoln said. They were the Confederate States of America. So it took victory to make that happen. And you can see how kind of late to the game we are behind Cuba, Brazil, etc. So just some context of slavery and how it moves. And so I asked you guys this in class. So again, this is for the other group to discuss. I want to put it in the slides. But those issues driving us toward disillusion, this is really the thesis of the paper. And again, we talked about this in class, the idea of what radical abolition, the immediate end to slavery, popping that balloon would destroy the Southern economy. Gradual emancipation has some promise, but can it work? And there's some obstacles in the way of that as well. But slowly letting the air out of the balloon instead of popping the balloon. Right. And again, we looked at these videos, so understand this is so that I drag this forward for the other cohort to look at some of the what was slavery like. And just this discussion. We did a little bit time-wise, giving you some team time. Limited that, but just remember, don't tie yourself with golden handcuffs to a job you hate because you buy too much junk and you can't afford to quit the job you hate because you got to pay the bills. right? Some of those bills, yeah, you gotta, you don't have control over per se, but some you do. Okay. All right, so that moves us to where we should be for chapter 13. So, words of the day. Um, the discussion, hyperbolic, vitriolic, synonymous really, filled with bitter criticism. And the reason that's a word of the day is as we move forward in time, the discussion, so-called, of slavery becomes more and more vitriolic. The very polarized ends of the political spectrum, abolitionists and fire eaters, they're not the majority of people, but they are surely making the loudest noise on both ends, and they are attacking each other viciously. And so that affects the overall psyche of the nation. Just like today, if you look at, CNN versus Fox and how they have vitriol for and against Biden, Trump, etc., that it affects the overall mood of the country and not for the better. Facts win the day. Vitriol is usually emotion. There's a thing called a proviso. It's usually added to or a piece of a document, maybe a legislative piece that's moving through Congress. We're going to talk today or in this video about a thing called the Wilmot Proviso. And it can pass or fail on its own merit. Sometimes it's put in as part of a larger piece of legislation. Same with this idea of an omnibus. It's kind of a weird word, but if you've got a series of laws wrapped up in an overall piece of legislation, it may have 3, 4, 5 different parts. And in a way, if you think about the Biden COVID tax relief legislation that's being discussed right now, it has a lot of pieces associated with it, to include the idea of minimum wage and more money for PPE, personal protective equipment, stuff like that. So there are elements, and what can happen is, let's say, this overall 4, 5, 6 piece legislation moves forward, and there's resistance to maybe one piece of it. That can actually be pulled out to allow for the overall legislation to pass. Or maybe it's just rewritten, if not pulled out. Okay? And we're going to talk about an omnibus package as we get to 1850. We see the rise of some of these splinter parties as the tension over slavery really spells the end of the Whig Party. They're going to crumble under the weight of slavery because you have Northern and Southern Whigs. You're going to see the Democrats do much of the same. Now, they survive through the war, but the party itself, a lot of Northern Democrats leave the Democratic Party, and it becomes more the party of Southern Democrats supporting slavery. This is one of those, the Know-Nothings, also known as the American Party. And where they got their name, it was in response to, we're seeing more and more of an influx of immigrants coming into the country. And especially Irish Catholics seem to get the brunt of the angst, because there's this concern, and if you think about it, the first Catholic president we ever had was John F. Kennedy, because there was a concern of, are you more loyal to the Pope being Catholic or more loyal to the country? And so this Know-Nothing, this American Party, is a nationalistic party. We don't like these foreigners coming in. And so the reason they get called the Know-Nothings is when they're asked, hey, what's going on with this American Party? What are you guys doing? What's happening? They would respond with, I don't know anything about it. And that's where they get that kind of slang, Know-Nothing. But it is the American Party. And what happens is some of these smaller, like the Free Soil Party, there's these different little independent parties that slowly coalesce around the idea of either limiting or ending slavery. And that's what the soil that the new Republican Party is going to grow out of. Okay? Yeah, there you go. Semi-secret organization. If you're asked, you're supposed to say, I know nothing. Okay? Kind of odd. All right, so back to abolitionists. It's hard to divorce ourselves from the discussion of abolitionists, but as they start out, it's a fairly small and really not that vocal a group, but over time they draw people that support the idea of abolishing slavery, and they become more and more vitriolic in nature. Okay, so early, mostly moral, religious issues. The idea of, well, look, the founding documents of the country, all men are created equal. And so it includes, and this makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Educated black Americans in the North, free blacks supporting the abolishment of slavery. Some of them came out of slavery. They were either released from slavery as the North rid itself of the institution, or like Frederick Douglass, saved up money and bought their way to freedom. Because that, the impact of, if I'm a small slaveholder and you pay for your freedom, it helps mitigate that cost of buying and caring for the slaves. One of the more strident voices, slowly becomes strident, is this William Lloyd Garrison. He publishes a paper called The Liberator, and attacking slaveholders is evil, right? And this was, kind of part of the last class, but it's a good review. He's controversial in the North, but man, he is hated, universally hated in the South for that. And so that idea, again, the North is not nothing but abolitionists. There's a division between abolitionists don't care because it doesn't affect me, and those that don't want to see slavery end because they could potentially lose their jobs. Right? So a few pictures to look at, and I like, we're moving now into the era of photography and actually audio recordings of interviews with some folks. And so here's Frederick Douglass, a very striking figure. Still young-looking Abraham Lincoln, clean-shaven. This is an older William Lloyd Garrison, and this, of course, is Harriet Tubman, one of the conductors of the Underground Railroad. And so as the opposition to slavery grows, we see the Underground Railroad become more and more effective. And we just mentioned that in the Chapter 12 information, but the Underground Railroad was the way to move slaves out of the South, and it started out moving them into what they call the border states, like Kentucky, for example. But as laws and the division between North and South become more and more severe, now we have to move further north. If you're on the Underground Railroad, Kentucky's not good enough. Now I got to go to Ohio. And eventually, after what we talk about at the end of this video, the 1850 Compromise, the fugitive slave law is reinforced to the point that I might have to escape all the way to Canada to escape the clutches of these mobs that are coming north to capture so-called runaway slaves. Because if you're black, you have to prove that you're not. And if you can't, guess what? You get to go back into slavery, even if you were a free black man in the North. Okay. So the Blue Star is a short video showing one of the mechanisms of the Underground Railroad, kind of a double-decker carriage that you could hide people under the bottom and fill the top with hay. And then this is a link to actually a website about the Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison's paper. And technology is wonderful. You can actually pull these up today. The anti-slavery societies. Remember, we talked about them a few decades ago in the timeline about pushing for, let's maybe send slaves back to Africa as a solution to the problem. And of course, that doesn't catch on very well, but Abraham Lincoln was a supporter of this for a while. And so you get speakers. They have a speaking tour. Because remember, there's the entertainment of the day back then. Of course, there's some music, yes, plays, but politics and public speaking, that was one of the attractions that people would go to. When we get to the Lincoln-Douglas debates, they were hugely popular because it was in a way entertainment to watch the two ideas back and forth. And the same here with folks like Theodore Weld, Frederick Douglass, other opponents to slavery. And if you can get a Southerner to come out, and if you watch that video on the previous page, there were Southerners who supported the Underground Railroad, supported the abolishment of slavery because they weren't slave owners. And remember, the population of the South, over 3/4 of them didn't own any slaves. So that was possible. Of course, black abolitionists make sense. And they could, like Frederick Douglass, he worked with William Lloyd Garrison for quite a while. And so you have these folks collecting and supporting this abolitionist movement. But guess what? And this one it's a little hard to wrap your head around maybe. But the North is coming to realize they have something to do with slavery. So we have, abolitionists, we have the I don't care crowd, we have the I don't want slavery to end crowd. But how on earth, slavery's really a Southern institution at this point. How does the North have something to do with it? If you think about dime, you think about the economic piece of this. Raw materials, you saw from the charts, and I'm going to throw them in here again because they're compelling. The amount of cotton, the demand for cotton, 1.1 billion tons as we approach 1860. Where is it going? Well, it's going some overseas, yes. The South hopes that when we get into war, that if we stop shipping cotton to England, maybe they'll come in on the side of the Confederacy. Hint, they don't. The mills of the North, the industry of the North demands the raw materials to make the manufactured goods. So the North is somewhat complicit in this idea of slavery because it makes for cheap raw materials, which makes for more potential profit. I hope that makes sense. Now, I'm not trying to say there, that obviously slavery is not in the North at this point, but there is a tie north to south economically. And I think that makes sense. So, yeah, Newton's third. The first video is just a gaffe, right? But it's a video about Newton's third law. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So for every action that goes on, either support of or abolition of slavery, there's an opposite reaction on the other side of the division, which is now north to south in this country. So the more you pick at abolishment, the more the South reacts in defense of, and vice versa. And so you see this escalation. That's why I use that. It's a balloon video. And then who was William Lloyd Garrison? A little background to him. What drove him? And he's publishing this paper, especially early on, himself, right? Hand typesetting everything. So it's quite the effort to publish The Liberator at this point. Okay? And again, we're going to plug into this period of time is exactly when Harriet Beecher Stowe publishes Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so when the group presents that, you'll see, oof, that's a big bucket of gasoline poured on the fire. But you'll understand why. And so looking at the socioeconomics of North and South, and look, this is very generalized, I understand that. But if you look at what's the economic engine of the North, right? Industry, manufacturing, finance, business is more what's driving the economy of the North. Workers still, you could call them wage slaves. Conditions are harsh, hours are long, it is dangerous, but they still at least have that option of trying to find someplace else to work. Right? So there is a difference in that wage slave moniker was used by the South to defend the more benign, in their minds, chattel slavery. So in the South, the economic engine is much more in the realm of agriculture. And go back to that map with all the pink dots that showed the explosion of cotton production. So really, King Cotton is a big, huge piece of the economic engine. Workers, sure, I mean, you had your small farmers, your dirt farmers, that I call them, and I don't mean to be derogatory, they're just working a small farm, but a lot of the workers of the South driving that economic engine are slaves. And I hope from the videos we watch, the pay and conditions, terrible. So what was chattel slavery? You were human machinery, you were property. So there's a difference here socioeconomically. Right? What that leads to, there is some wealth inequality as well. And not just between North and South, but within those two sectional pieces of the country. So in the North, right, factory owners, merchants doing well, as you would expect. Now there's some ups and downs, of course. Unskilled workers, not so much. Okay, so poor whites, free blacks, Indians, immigrants, right? We talked about Irish Catholics come into this country. Not so much the working poor, the urban poor. We're going to see that exacerbated as we move beyond the Civil War and into 2112, when the cities really explode, like New York City, and how these elements get worse. Homelessness, theft. I mean, the cities are just disgusting. For until they can put together sewage systems, sanitary commissions to pick up trash. And so things in the north for some are quite good, for others are pretty bleak. In the south, we could almost say the same thing. Planters doing really well. You've got those small independent farmers, tenant farmers who would be really sharecroppers, kind of serfs in a way. And then at the bottom of that socioeconomic ladder are the slaves. So it's a simple question, simple answer. Who's doing the best? I should have mixed those up, so you had to pick, but obviously those with large plantations, large workforces are doing the best, and you move down that. So there are some similarities in so much as wealth inequality in the north and in the south. You had those doing very well, and kind of the rest struggling to get by or doing poorly. And so to me, if you think about this, we tend to overly generalize, right? The idea that only 1/4 of the South owned any slaves, and only 1/10 of 1% owned more than 100. So the North is not all abolitionists. The South is not all planter class or slaves. There are other elements in there, and they sometimes get forgotten. Yeah, remember these charts. The one about the value of, because the slave population is growing, so naturally the value goes up, and doing the work to produce this much raw cotton, I need more slaves. And if I can make a lot of money using slaves, that drives up the price of each individual slave. So money to be made. And let's go back to that idea of how is the North complicit? Raw cotton consumption. The South's not consuming all this cotton, so it's going overseas or to the textile factories of the North. So they're a piece of this puzzle as well. What does this tell you about the wealth of the planter class? Top 1/10 of 1%. And the same arguments around today. Right? CEOs making 400 times what the average worker makes. CEOs should make more. They got a lot more responsibility. But at what point is enough enough? And the discussion of minimum wage and how, it's going to jack the prices up. There's been several studies that refute that. Yes, there is some of that plowed back into the cost, but 8% increase versus a 100% change in minimum wage, may be worth it. All right, shifting gears for a minute. As we move into this period, you saw the title of the chapter. There is a kind of reform, religious element during this period as well. We saw even at the founding, church going wasn't a huge thing, but as we move into the era of good feelings and certainly beyond that, there's more and more, I guess more free time allows for it as part of it, but more of a religious growth in the country. So this was, some of the early founders deists, right? They're kind of non-denominational. They believe in God in some form or fashion, but maybe not so much into structured religion. Okay, even Lincoln was that way a little bit. It's hard to pin him down on what his religion was perfectly, but you listen to his speeches, you read his writings, he's always talking about God and how that element of God affects the Civil War, even, right? That every drop of blood drawn with the lash will be repaid by the sword. And he's talking about the scripture in that case. So you have some kind of open religion still around today, Unitarians and Universalists, pushing away from, going all the way back to the founding of some of the colonies, Calvinism, puritanical teachings, things like that. And you see more of these happen, these kind of revivals. And you see them even still today, right? Especially in the summertime, there'll be like a tent revival, a 3 or 4 day meeting to try to reinvigorate people's religious fervor. Right? passionate conversions, right? You see that some of these TV evangelists. Let's move on from that. And so we see some of the more current, what you're familiar with, religious groups develop. Baptists, adult baptism, being reborn through baptism, um, and Baptist Methodists, right? If there's a Wesleyan college, right, but John Wesley, so Tennessee Wesleyan is a Methodist college, and there's a lot of those. Stricter moral behavior sounds a little bit more puritanical, doesn't it? Than maybe the Unitarian type churches. We have Adventist. I mean, Chattanooga is huge with, we've got Seventh Day Adventists. You got the college up in uh, Collegedale here. Um, so that's still around. The Seventh Day Adventists come out of the early Adventists. They had been a prediction of the world's going to end. And they called it the Great Disappointment. It's like, what? They're disappointed the world didn't end? I guess if you put all your eggs in that world's going to end on this day basket. But that's what the evolution of the Seventh Day Adventists come out of that. And so, the question is, when was the last time there was this end of the world scare? If you guys remember, the Mayan calendar, right, was supposed to end on a certain day. I don't remember what it was, but maybe that's just they just ran out of room to make the calendar go any further, or they thought, that's far enough into the future. I don't know. But every so often, this end of the world thing will come up, and somebody picks some arbitrary date. Right? Y2K was a good one, right? End of the world. Otherwise known as the Mormons, right? Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And these folks, maybe some odd views if you look at it from the outside. I'm not one to criticize people's beliefs. Remember what the founders said: will not establish nor prohibit. So there's no prohibition to this. But the Mormons were really persecuted across the country. And that's why they end up moving east to west out to Salt Lake City. And some of the beliefs, the idea of polygamy, still, it's not illegal in the church. Multiple wives, right? So this persecution, Ohio, Missouri, Illinois, they're kind of trying to find a place to be left alone. And you can see that they're not. Joseph Smith gets murdered. Because of this, the Mormons start collecting, saving. They've got quite the stash, if you will. They're kind of the world's best preppers if there is an end of the world. And so they finally move out to the Great Salt Lake Basin, where they prospered. If you've ever been out there, like the Mormon Tabernacle is amazing. Another group, and you see some of these kind of utopian groups develop. This is one in Oneida that basically said, hey, we're in heaven right now. So because of that, there is no sin. So I added the party part. Because if there's no sin, there's no harm in doing whatever it is you want. And you can see what some of the things they did: free love, complex marriages, many men and women in a marriage. And of course, it's sort of like the Mormons, to those more strictly religious, I suppose, this seems like sinful, terrible activity, right? And eventually they gave this up, as often utopian communities do fall apart. The idea of it being a perfect community is impossible to keep going. So they gave it up and became craftsmen. And that's why, if you've ever heard of Oneida Silverware, that's where it comes from. And it started with this utopian group. And it's only about 150 miles from, and I say think free love, right? It's only 150 miles from Woodstock, New York, right? The great festival at the end of the 60s at Woodstock. Okay, some other elements: Shakers, celibate hard workers, kind of, Shakers, Quakers, they're similar at least. And this idea of not religion specific, but spirituality, seances, gathering together, holding hands, candles, to be able to speak to communicate with the dead. One of the people that believed that, and believed it pretty firmly, was Mary Lincoln. And she tried to do that when their son Willie died, and it really tore her up. And there's times where Abraham Lincoln is thinking about putting her in the madhouse because she just can't stop crying and mourning over the death of Willie. And of course, Abraham Lincoln's torn up by it as well, but he's a much more withdrawn type character. But it affects him as well. The death of Anne Rutledge, his first love, and the death of his son. Lincoln today would be medically called depressed. They called it back then melancholy. But you kind of see it in just his look and some of his speeches. But his wife tried to communicate with their dead son. Something else going on, something else we need to reform is there's far too much drinking going on in America. And so the Demon Rum was, one of the more popular, the Whiskey Rebellion, if you remember that. Um, Traditionally drank large amounts, and not just of rum, of kind of whatever you could get your hands on, to include moonshine. And so this temperance movement, they say, you know what? Alcohol affects people badly, and it especially affects those that can least afford it, the poor. And we see that argument today with things like the lottery, that people are spending their hard-earned money that they really can't afford, hoping they win the big prize in the lottery. And so that temperance movement, the idea of at least limiting, if not eliminating alcohol, starts to spread. And we're going to see it come to full fruition. It takes a while. But in the early 1900s, with the 18th Amendment saying thou shalt not drink, right? Prohibition, right? Right as the Great Depression starts. So yeah, that doesn't go over very well. And so there's a difference, moderation versus abstinence. And then can I persuade you morally that drinking too much is bad, it's bad for you, it's bad for your family? Or do I have to resort to legal persuasion, i.e. make it illegal? And it's difficult to enforce, right? Prohibition laws, even the 18th Amendment, it was almost impossible to enforce. That's why you had speakeasies and Al Capone, etc. Because if there's a demand, somebody will figure out a way to supply it. And when there's a demand and it's illegal, that pushes it underground and makes for potentially massive profits, but also criminality. And so that last question, just point to ponder. Should Congress legislate morality? Are there some things that should be illegal? Because the discussion of, legalizing marijuana. Are the pros, do they outweigh the cons? And it depends on where you sit, but at least there are pros and cons to it, where you can go further down the drug chain, if you will, to meth. Should we legalize that? No. Look at what it does to people. It destroys them physically, mentally, emotionally. So there are some places perhaps where morality should be, but there's also places where Congress should leave their nose out of it to allow us. Look, there's nothing that says you can't make stupid choices. You may have to pay the consequences, either physically or legally. So here's this was kind of a famous piece of propaganda, and I know it's very difficult to read, so I've got another version of it. But it's called The Drunkard's Progress. And here you start off with just a glass, right? And it becomes more and more. Things, get worse and worse, and eventually you're committing suicide at the end. And look who's left behind, the poor old widow and orphan, right? And so the steps of this, again, a piece of propaganda, are as follows. A glass with a friend. Step 2, a glass to keep the bold chat going. Ooh, a glass too much. Drunk and riotous, right? The companions, a party of mad drunkards. So it keeps going down this list, right? Eventually you're going to spend all your money on booze, you're going to be diseased, forsaken, going to go steal to get more, and then finally commit suicide. Yeah. Of course, there's probably somebody that's followed this path, but most folks that, have a glass of wine at the end of the day don't end up committing suicide. This was printed, published, the artwork was done by a guy named Nathaniel Currier. And you may not have heard of him, but I'll show you on the next slide. He's pretty famous. The Blue Star Video is another piece of propaganda that follows the same arc of The Drunkard's Progress. It's a movie. It was made in the early 1930s, I want to say, called Reefer Madness and the Devil Weed. Right? And so if you click on this, and I bet it's a crack up, but it is propaganda in the realm of the drunkard's progress. And that's what this is, right? It's the overview of uh, Reefer Madness. Curriers, famous for Currier and Ives, probably one of the most famous of Christmas card makers. Even still today, the company's around, right? These famous winter scenes and the like. So that's who did that. Interesting. Okay, finishing up on reformers. There is some movement on support of women, women's right to vote, etc. Women are a big part of this temperance movement because you go back to who suffers from it, right? Poor old widow and orphan down here. So they're the ones kind of supporting temperance. And what this does is it puts them more and more in a political spotlight. Now, it's not enough yet to get women's right to vote. But during this time frame, some states, and the first one being Wyoming, allows women the right to vote at least in local elections, if not national. It's going to take until the 19th Amendment, 1920, to get the overall right for women to vote. But this is the start of the movement. And like a lot of things, movements start and then get interrupted by events beyond them, like Civil War, like World War I or II, things like that. Okay. Oops, man, I keep getting dyslexia. So one of the famous conventions, the early meeting to put together some ideas, right to vote, economic rights in marriage, because they didn't have it, and including lots of different professions and expanding what is women's work as well. And so a few of the famous folks, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton at the Seneca Falls Convention. Out of all of these, if we look at these reforms and religious movements, etc., who's left out? And the answer is the slave, right? The downtrodden, the poor, but certainly the slaves. The African Americans are left out. And women's rights, this momentum kind of gets pushed aside for the push toward abolition of slavery. And of course, the Civil War, the focus, not the time for focusing on that as we're trying to reestablish the Union. All right, driving toward the finish line now. Political status not really changed, right? The Constitution allowed for the Fugitive Slave Act, that if they run away, slaves run away, that owners can retrieve them. The Missouri Compromise is hanging on so far. But the country, the expansion westward is straining that compromise. And as I mentioned, these border states between the North and South are seeing a growing runaway slave problem. Okay? And so one of the solutions is just let them reinvigorate, reopen the international slave trade. It's like, we're not going back to that. That was part of the Constitution. So it would take an amendment, and that's never going to pass in this environment. Yes, Congress still regulated through the Missouri Compromise, that's true, but that's going to be strained to the point of breaking here in the future. And Dred Scott and the Kansas-Nebraska Act are a big part of that breakage. So here's that idea of a proviso, kind of an addendum, an amendment, right, to a piece of legislation. The idea is, hey, all that territory gained from the war with Mexico, right, the other half of Texas all the way out through New Mexico, Arizona, would be barred from having slavery, which is against the Missouri Compromise. So believe it or not, it passes in the House, which tells you where they lean, either abolitionist or fire eater, pro or anti-slavery, but not in the Senate. So it dies at that point. But it shows, it illustrates some of the division in the country. Now, John C. Calhoun, right, that picture of, he kind of looks like the Professor Brown from Back to the Future. He says, look, we should be able to take slaves to all the new territories, Oregon, California, any of them. And if that's allowed, then we open up slavery really throughout the country. So is that where we want to go? But you can see the staking out of political extremes at this point. So enter another new party, right? The American Party, the Know Nothings. Here's another one, the Free Soil Party, saying it's free men, free labor, free soil. that there should be no slavery in any of the territories. So it's becoming more and more polarized. So of course during this time there's always elections going on, so you have different elements, and this is really the last gasp for the Whig Party. Democrats remain, the Whigs are going to fall apart. The Free Soils, we saw Van Buren, remember he had to hold the bag of crap from the economic collapse of Andrew Jackson and his gold policy. He's back in the game, and Taylor actually wins this. So the last gasp of the Whigs, because they are going to fall apart under the issue of Northern Southern Whigs over slavery. And one of the things, Taylor was not big on compromise. We get to 1850, which this kind of wraps us up. He was going to block it, but he ends up dying, and Millard Fillmore comes in as president. He's much more akin to compromise. And so we see this gold rush develop, the draw going out west. And we talked about, going westward, open land, right? But the potential to make big bucks, the gold rush, hence the San Francisco 49ers. And so now we have California wanting to be admitted as a state, which causes a crisis because the 3630 line cuts it in half. Pro-slavery oppose admitting it as a free state. It's petitioning to enter as a free state. And there's a thing out there, and it's percolating. It's been brought up, but it's going to come to fruition when we get to Kansas, Nebraska. It's called popular sovereignty. And that means the states, when they petition to enter the Union, can decide, regardless of the 3630 line, if they want to come in as a free or slave state. So that's why, in a sense, Kansas, Nebraska blows the 1820 Compromise out of the water. So here's your omnibus bill. Good old Henry Clay, the great compromiser. He's going to put together all of these under one legislative element, one law. California comes in free. We settled there was a dispute between Texas and New Mexico between the states. We avoid the issue of slavery in other territories. We jink around the Wilmot Proviso, and we strengthen the Fugitive Slave Act. All of these in one bill make it really impossible because there's something for everybody, but there's also something for everybody to hate in this. So what's the solution? It's to pick it apart and pass it independently. Because if I remove some of this and reword a little bit of it, maybe I can get these to pass as single element laws, if you will. So we break up the omnibus bill. Anything odd about that? Preserving slavery in Washington, D.C. Doesn't seem. It seems to me like the ultimate statement of what this country was not supposed to be. That there were African auctions, African American auction sites, slave auction sites in the Capitol, right outside the White House, because these are the different places where slave auctions, right outside the Capitol, right outside the White House. Ay, ay, ay. But that's part of this omnibus package. So it fails. Imagine that. And so instead, what we're going to do is break it up. And so you have these two elements in Congress opposing the omnibus bill. Clay, the great compromiser, Daniel Webster speak for it. And this guy, Frederick Douglass, who's way up there on the political power scale, really helps drive this thing to the finish. But even if that would have happened, if President Taylor would have stayed alive, he probably likely would have vetoed it. He said he was going to. So it's not looking good, even if we break it up. But guess what? Fate intervenes. He dies. Millard Fillmore becomes president. He's willing to sign it. And so that's where Stephen Douglas helps navigate this through. And piece by piece, the Compromise of 1850, as it's called, passes. And a lot of that's down to Douglas's skill. But what does it do? Almost nothing to ease the tension in the country. And you can see, based on the elements within it, there's a piece for you and a piece for you, and it really doesn't unify or compromise on much of anything. And I think there's two key pieces here. One of the things that changed, thankfully, is the slave trade was banned in Washington, D.C. And Abraham Lincoln actually supported this as well. But it's just for no more slave auctions in the Capitol. So is it significant? Visually, I guess it is, yes, but it doesn't stop the slave trade anywhere else, just in the capital. But this was the one that really set more fuel on the fire, a much stronger Fugitive Slave Act. And we'll talk more about that as we move towards Civil War. But really the idea was you had to, if you were black and captured and accused of being a runaway slave, good luck proving that you weren't, because there were economic incentives, even to judges, to say, no, I don't believe you, you're a slave, see you later, back to the South with you. Man, think about what that does to folks in the North, especially abolitionists. Explosion. Right? Harsher punishment if you interfered, i.e. the Underground Railroad. That's bad. So actually, here's some of the fines. And this is real money, right? If you fail to help. So if I come from the South with a posse trying to capture my runaway slaves, and I kind of deputize you to help and you don't, you can be fined. If you provide food and shelter, not just fined, but now thrown in jail. So that's at the Underground Railroad operators. And incentives for those who capture and those who judge folks to be slaves. So it opened up, it's like open season. It doesn't matter if you're a free man in the North or not. All you had to do was, I captured you, I say this is my runaway slave, and you, a black man, have to prove it. Good luck, right? It was assumed that all blacks were runaways. Imagine what that does to abolitionists. So you look at 1 and 2 again. Does it suggest anything positive? Step 1 does a little bit, the idea of banning the slave trade in the capital, but it's a small piece. But does it show anything negative? Does it show how divided the nation was? And this whole thing about the stronger Fugitive Slave Act, it's just another step in the division between North and South, between slave power and abolitionists. So think about it. What does that do? The South loves it. The North hates it. And it's another cut in the division between North and South. So here we go. We're finishing up. Here's some debate on the 1850 Compromise. Some famous folks involved. I mentioned Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, John C. Calhoun. Look, these guys are very short for this world at this point. They're kind of the second generation of heavy hitters. And so, let's see, I think I got these. There you go. There's Daniel Webster looking very tired. It kind of looks like you guys in class half the time. There's Henry Clay making his impassioned plea for compromise. There's John C. Calhoun looking like the nutty professor in the back. And I ask in class, and see if you guys don't notice, there's something very eerie. This is a famous picture, kind of like the phony signing of the Declaration picture. But if you look in the background, let me get rid of these arrows. The first time I saw this, I was like, whoa. Of course, this is just drapery, decoration, right, in the Congress. But man, doesn't that look like the angel of death hanging over this? And maybe that's, I don't know that it was on purpose, but certainly the angel of death, i.e. the Civil War, is really looming, because we can't, you could see how this, yes, it's a compromise, but only kind of in name only. And you guys have seen this speech before, this idea of liberty first and union afterwards, that Daniel Webster didn't like that. And he said, no, liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable. That we've got to stop putting sectional differences above union. And of course we don't, and it comes to disunion and civil war, finally. Yep, just mentioned this. So you see the old guard, right? The folks that at least might listen to each other or compromise on some things. John C. Calhoun was pretty vitriolic, but Henry Clay, right, the great compromiser, is now dead. So that opens the door to the new generation of, and a lot of these are what we call radicals, either radical abolitionists, and eventually once the Republican Party starts, radical Republicans. So with them may have died the last chance for compromise. Because folks coming in, these fire eaters, these radical abolitionists, are less and less talking to each other and more screaming at each other. Or Preston Brooks beating the crap out of Charles Sumner on the floor of the Senate. Okay, so of course there's an anti-slavery faction and there's a pro-slavery faction in Congress, and that piece, the difference really spells the end for the Whig Party. Okay. There are some Northern Democrats sympathetic to the South. They're called dough faces. There's some funny names given to folks, right? Copperheads, dough faces, etc. And kind of on the outside looking in at this point is Abraham Lincoln. This was a picture taken just before he gave one of his most famous speeches at the Cooper Union, right, which kind of vaulted him further into national prominence. But the reason I put this up here, and this isn't 100% right, that's why I noted here. You look at Lincoln, and his life is defined by failure. If you look at it, right, here's where Anne Rutledge dies, and he spends inordinate amount of time at her gravesite. People think he's losing his mind in 1836. He does get married to Mary Todd, becomes Mary Lincoln, and she's as, or maybe more so, inspired to push him toward political prominence. So she's pushing him, and you can see defeat, defeat, defeat. He did win a term in the House of Representatives, a 2-year term, and then was not defeated, but it was the Whig Party's policy to nominate a new candidate to kind of rotate people. So Lincoln, at that point when he was in Congress, was a Whig. Okay? But of course the Whig Party's going to fall apart. And then defeated. What brings him really to national predominance is here, 1858, when he's running for the Senate against a guy named Douglas, right? Not Frederick Douglass, Stephen Douglas. The Lincoln-Douglas debates vault him even further into national prominence. And we'll talk a lot about how in the world did this guy who lost, again, he did win one here, so that's wrong, end up becoming the president of the United States. There was a time in the mid-1840s where he thought his political career was dead. He was just going to be a lawyer for the rest of his life. Self-taught, by the way. And just tying up the last of this 1850s time frame, Franklin Pierce is going to be followed by the worst president, James Buchanan, in 1856. But look, even on the cabinet of Pierce, you've got this guy Jefferson Davis from Mississippi as his Secretary of War on his cabinet. Guess what? Jeff Davis becomes the president of the Confederacy when the southern states secede. Okay? Davis tries to revive efforts to annex Hawaii, Cuba, etc., to expand slave power in the South. The South also wants the first transcontinental railroad to go on the southern route to help the South economically. I mean, think about it, a rail connecting across the country entirely. If you're along that railway, man, you could see your city just boom as people stop, hotels, restaurants, etc. And so he facilitates, if you remember from the map, it was that little piece, kind of south part of Arizona, the Gadsden Purchase, and that was to allow for the Transcontinental Railroad to go through there. And now all this work and effort, and the climate's better to build the railroad across the South, it actually ends up being built in the North. And part of that comes from Stephen Douglas, right, the guy who was debating Lincoln. He has business ties with the Union Pacific Railroad, and in fact, it's going to push him to develop this idea of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, popular sovereignty. So it's all tied together, and guess what? In the end, it spells the demise of Stephen Douglas. He was the front runner. He was supposed to win the presidency in 1860, and he barely makes a tick on the map because of all what goes on here. So just kind of a hint. So under an hour, not bad. Next week, the last quiz. Again, I'll leave it open through Sunday. The 2 presentations on Dred Scott and Uncle Tom's Cabin, and of course the paper's still out there in the future but looming, and use some of this discussion. We've mentioned quite a few things now, elements driving the country apart, so pick a couple, 3 of those. Thesis statement is the country is being divided over XYZ, And then the XYZ are your main points about either issues of slavery or the Transcontinental Railroad or economics or whatever it might be. So not a super complex piece of work, right? Just a matter of sitting down and doing it. All right, finished up. So that's chapter 13. Again, the first parts you guys had already seen from chapter 12. It's for the other group. So that's why I just skipped over them. Monday, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Tuesday, Dred Scott decision. So teams, remember, if you want to send me a draft, go ahead. Right? Send a draft copy of the presentation and I'll send you some feedback on it. Otherwise, don't be the weakest link. Help your teammates put it together, and we'll see you guys the beginning of next week.